Namani. We've got some money eyes out there, so that's really wonderful to hear language being used, the language of the Kaurna people. Let's call upon the ancestors of my people to bring us goodness and send away those sad things that follow us. Tuwela Manibudni Tuwela Wakanapadni Nai Gana Biako Maklankla Marwachanga Gana Miena Gana Miena Na Mani Budni Wangandi Gana Yatana Irindi Yata Mika Rindi Gudla Ma Bamba Bambaya. So welcome to this place. Welcome to this conversation about climate change. It is a pleasure to not only welcome you and to say, are you well when you come to a place, but also to say our face tells us where we've been and our heart tells us where we go, because when we welcome people, it is the opportunity to exchange in knowledge and wisdom, because our people believe that no one person held all of that knowledge. And so therefore, to expand on knowledge, we welcome people to these places. And when you come to a place, it's saying you are the important person. And I am a descendant of not only the Kaurna people, but the Narungga people. My name is Mickey O'Brien, or my Aboriginal name is that of the Impatient One. I am the sixth-born male of 7 children. And I was born here on this coast, and I still live here on this coast. Climate change is obviously a very important topic, and our people have obviously witnessed that in their time in living in this continent, which is the driest continent, and obviously being South Australia, the driest state. And so climate was very important to our people, and we understood that very well. And the ways that we understand this is the knowledge that we pass on to our people. And it's written in some of the songs, in some of the artwork that still carries on today. Our people, when they saw some of this climate changing, when particularly the waters had risen, they had no idea in some ways of what that meant. They felt that sometimes it was because they had done something wrong. And so they heated up some rocks and they rolled them down the mountain into the waters to try and hold back that water. To hurt the water, would you believe? They built fencing to hold back that water. But through time and knowledge, they understood and managed the climate. They did fire stick farming. And recently here in the city of Adelaide, we did some of that to demonstrate the importance of how the environment flourishes when we do the fire stick farming. My father did a project not long ago about planting trees strategically, and they improved the rainfall in the Eyre Peninsula there at Cummins by using the knowledge that our people understood about the importance of tree planting. They also knew that if you slowed a river down, not necessarily stop a river, but slow a river down, it enables that water to fill the land, to hold back those salts that sometimes can rise from the ground. So I encourage you not only to take the knowledge of these wonderful panellists here and the wonderful scientists that continue to debate these arguments, but maybe to look into some of the knowledge of the Aboriginal peoples that may enlighten us in what to expect. And so I'm going to leave you a story about how the government man came to the wise elders to ask these questions about climate change. And it told the wise elders that the world was getting hotter, and they wanted to know these knowledges. And as he asked this question of the great elders, there was no response. He again asked the question to the great elders who were sitting in a circle, and again no response. And so he decided to change his questioning. Instead of asking about what the climate was doing, he decided to ask them what they were doing. Because you could see they were sitting in the circle doing something. And he said to them, "What is it that you're doing?" And they responded, they said, "We're making cloaks." The government man got upset and said, "But why would you be making cloaks when I have just explained to you the world is getting hotter?" And the wise elders responded, "What follows great heat is great cold. We won't be able to make the cloaks in the great cold, so we make them now." So why is that story important? It's not to say that we don't need to know what is coming. We certainly need to be prepared, and we certainly need to understand why things are changing. But we need to spend just as much time on why it's changing into how we can live in those changes. Because maybe we won't have the time when it comes to do something about it. So I encourage all of us to be a part of not only this debate, but to understand that each one of us has an opportunity to make a difference. So I leave you these words. My unjaga, nachi yukandaya, nachi yakandaya, padniya do what do. It's saying we are truly all brothers and sisters. When we walk the land, we not only should do it in harmony, we should do it together, realise culture does bring us together. Never say goodbye because we have no word. Always say see you later because we will see you in the physical as well as the spiritual. So nakara, nechaya. Please enjoy not only the spirit of our ancestors, but these wonderful panellists behind me. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to AdaptNow, Changing for Climate Change. My name is Rory McClaren and I'm your MC for this evening. Please join me once again in thanking Uncle Mickey O'Brien for his welcome to country tonight. Well, it's great to see so many of you here at the beautiful Woodville Town Hall for this evening, and also a special hello to those who are joining us online via our live stream. Tonight's event has been convened by AdaptWest, a collaborative partnership between the councils of the Western Adelaide regions, the cities of Charles Sturt, Port Adelaide, Enfield and West Torrens. Join me now in hearing from the three mayors of the AdaptWest partnership, who will provide some further context about AdaptWest, the Western Adelaide region, and the reason behind tonight's event, AdaptNow, Changing for Climate Change.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to have you here this evening to our AdaptNow Changing for Climate Change event. I trust that you'll find it a wonderful opportunity to engage and build hope and enthusiasm for our future together.
In the Western region, adapting to climate change is so critical. We have 300,000 residents and we're home to 21,000 businesses.
Our environment is changing all the time and we need to be aware of this, finding ways that we can understand the environment that we live in.
There are a number of challenges that are faced by the region when it comes to extreme weather events.
Our communities are experiencing longer and hotter summers. We know that heat waves are the cause of the largest number of fatalities of any natural disasters.
We're really aware that the Port River has flooding concerns for us. We're working with CSIRO and the Adelaide Uni. So by working with these organisations, we'll have a much better understanding to be able to help others understand also.
We're all subject to the consequences of infill development, which is reducing our tree canopy across the Western region. So one of the projects that AdaptWest has undertaken is urban heat mapping.
Heat mapping is the start of collecting data that will assist us in identifying the most severe heat affected areas.
Making changes to have a cooler environment is really important to me, it's really important to our council, and we have the data that shows that we have a lot of work to do.
And our strategy going forward includes planting more trees, ensuring that our parks and reserves are are well hydrated.
The cities of Port Adelaide, Enfield, Charles Sturt and West Torrens have come together to create AdaptWest, which is our response to the changing climate and the needs of our community.
What's happening at the moment affects all of us. We're not constrained by the boundaries of council areas, and I think what we need to be abundantly aware of is that we're all part of a larger community.
We formed AdaptWest to be able to build resilience toward climate change, to be able to protect our environment. So working together, this is the best and most effective way we can do it across our 3 councils. Along with the state government and federal government and other industry, we must all work together to make a difference.
We have greater leverage. We can create better innovation. We can have greater collaboration within our communities. And that means better outcomes for all.
I think one of the important aspects of our humanity is our capacity to get together and solve problems.
The solution doesn't come from one group. We need to engage with all parts of our community.
There are people in our community who haven't had these conversations before, and we'd love for them to be engaging with us to understand what they can do to make a difference.
I think one of the great opportunities in this event is that we can listen to one another, we can be part of a conversation, we can share with one another our learnings, and it's out of that environment, I think, of hopefulness, that creativity can be generated, and that in turn gives us opportunities to think about what it is we're going to do and how we're going to participate in being the solution.
I'd love to see people getting to know their neighbours. When you get to know your neighbours and you have these conversations, people around you will be able to understand and learn directly from you, and you'll be able to create an amazing connectedness with other people. So this is about communities coming together. It's about all of us working to make a change.
I think today is about giving us hope and reassurance that yes, we do know something, we do have some resources, we do and we can have a plan moving forward. And now we have to move and be very active and purposeful about what that's going to be.
Coming together, particularly in times like we've been experiencing the last 18 months, is important. As we've just heard from Mayor Angela Evans, we as humans have a great ability to solve problems, and the climate future we are facing requires us all to come together, look after one another, share what we've learnt, and act. It's our hope that through tonight's event you will hear something new, have thoughts sparked about how you, as an individual, a family member, a friend, a neighbour, or business owner can take action to better prepare for extreme weather events that will occur as a result of our changing climate now and over the longer term. As some of you may know, my day job is reporting for the ABC, which is why I'm particularly excited to be a part of this evening's proceedings, because of course the ABC is the state's emergency broadcaster. And as the broadcaster, we also want to hear your stories, so feel free to get in touch at any stage. Extreme events like heat waves, bushfires, flooding and storms are already becoming more frequent, intense and longer because of climate change. And we don't experience these events in isolation. At times we are experiencing extreme events concurrently or one after the other, giving us little time to recover in between. A perfect example of this was the Cherry Gardens bushfires a little earlier this year, when we saw extreme heat, fire, bushfire smoke, a power outage, then rain and some minor flooding, all happening in the space of about 72 hours. It is this aspect, multiple, concurrent, compounding extreme events, that we are going to focus on tonight, and we'll explore through a hypothetical scenario which is set in 3 years' time. Tonight we will see a series of extreme events play out over a period of 3 weeks in 2025. With the help of our panellists, who I will introduce shortly, we will explore what we can do to be better prepared and adapt in the short term, but also how we can adapt in the future. This focus on the future is important. It's through adaptation that we can build our resilience to climate change impacts and make sure that we are not only prepared for extreme events that might happen next week, next month or next year, but over the next 20, 30, 40 years and into the future. But before we get into the hypothetical, a few housekeeping matters very briefly. If there is an emergency alarm, that will sound and staff on site will provide directions. There are emergency exits located at the front of the town hall where you came in through, also through the kitchen area. And there are also, the area for congregation is in the back car park behind the town hall and also in the car park across the road should that be required. Toilets, including accessible toilets, are located off the foyer at the front of the town hall where you entered. Please be COVID safe. This includes wearing your mask while you're in the town hall. We are also live streaming and filming tonight's events. Some of you may have already spoken with the team who are doing the film before we started. I'd also encourage you to stop by on the way out and share your thoughts about tonight's proceedings. Please also be aware that some of the visual effects tonight will also include loud noises and potentially some strobe lighting. We hope to finish by 9 p.m, I believe. And finally, we are also using an online platform called Mentimeter to gather your questions. Now, there was a QR code as you came in this evening, and you can access that. That'll take you to menti.com. Now, if you didn't use that QR code, use the web browser on your phone, go to menti.com on your smart device, and then enter the code 175204. That's 175204, and follow the prompts to ask your questions. Now, please post questions at any time during this evening's proceedings, and we will get to them later on. Now, to help develop the hypothetical and gather insights to basically inform the scenario that we will play out this evening, a series of workshops and a business breakfast were held with community members and businesses from the Western region of Adelaide. At the community workshops, a walk a mile in my shoes type approach was used. Community members role-played to help draw out how others in the community who are more vulnerable during extreme events due to age, health conditions, financial circumstances and cultural background would cope and what they could do to better prepare themselves in the future. At the business breakfast briefing, businesses from the region talked about the actions they have taken to be more resilient to climate change impacts and make sure their businesses can operate successfully in the future. The community workshops and business breakfasts provide the opportunity for learning as people shared stories about their own experiences of extreme weather events and the changes that have to be made to adapt to climate change's impacts, or could make to be better prepared for the future and to make sure our community and businesses are resilient and thrive in the face of a changing climate. The process leading up to tonight's event has been documented along the way, with film crew living stories capturing the workshops facilitated by URPS to create an ongoing resource for others to learn from. For its inaugural viewing tonight, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this short film, AdaptNow, Changing for Climate Change.
Thank you so much for coming along today to talk about the Western Adelaide region and how climate change might impact it into the future.
Today we've got a great session planned for you, and we've got some wonderful speakers to hear from and understand more about how the Western region may be impacted by a changing climate and, importantly, what it might mean for businesses like yours.
AdaptWest is the Western Adelaide Climate Change Adaptation Plan. So it operates across the cities of West Torrens, Charles Sturt and Port Adelaide Enfield. We've got people from all over the world who make their home in Western Adelaide.
Coal communities for many reasons are most vulnerable to climate change related disaster events for many reasons in many different levels. First of all, maybe a language barrier or not having access to mainstream emergency alert communication system.
Adapting to climate change will involve all levels of government, business and the community, and we each have our roles to play in that challenge.
Yeah, the size of PepsiCo, we know that we have a large impact with climate change.
Honestly, day-to-day business is tough. Human beings are so used to being resilient and just taking things as they come. I feel like, until some major event happens to prompt us, it's just not given too much thought by, mid to small business.
It can feel like we're completely helpless because we're not big enough to enact what we would deem in our own minds as meaningful change.
Part of adaptation is about the knowledge and awareness, so understanding what that future is going to look like, but also thinking about what are the impacts it's going to have on the things that we value.
What we've really noticed in relation to extreme weather events is two things. Firstly, the storms and the frequency of storms and the damage it does to the beach. The other is power outages. So in peak periods when it's really, really hot and we're at high demand of pulling down power, we over the last sort of 5 years ago had lots and lots of outages.
One thing I found in that last power outage that we had, I was talking to one of my neighbours and she couldn't boil a cup of tea and all she wanted was a cup of tea. So, you know, I had her come over and just have a cup of tea, and since then we've become good friends actually.
Climate change is a fundamental concern, and sometimes we as individuals and communities can feel helpless. What do I do? What can I do personally in order to change the trajectory of my nation, of the world? But we can as individuals do a lot. What can we then do as a community? What can we do as an economy? What can our business community do?
We're basically saying we're looking for people to change what they do in order to be able to cope better when situations arise like these extreme events.
I've got Amal, who's 15 years old. She migrated to Australia 6 years ago from South Sudan.
So we've got Allegra, she's 23 and she lives at home with no air conditioning. She's unemployed, experiences anxiety and lives alone.
So an extreme heatwave warning has been issued for the Adelaide metropolitan area over the next 3 days.
What do you think's going on for your character right now?
She has a low income, so she might be thinking, could I go somewhere else? But it'd be like, well, can I afford the petrol if I have a car?
It sounds like there's a pretty large extended family living in one house. So yeah, they're going to be cooking in their house.
If I don't have money, how can I adapt to that? How can I put trees or plants in my house? How can I have a new AC, air conditioner? What is the cost to do all these changes? If the people don't know what to do, where to start, who can help them, who can support them, they start to panicking, they start to stress, they start to overwhelm, they are in fear. It's like, what can I do? What can I do? And they don't know what to do.
It's really hard, I guess, to see the impacts of climate change on a day-to-day basis, I guess.
It's so easy, and I fully understand why people like the general public and just the guy on the street looks at the scale of the situation and the ramifications and just gets paralysed by it. But I think as business owners and as entrepreneurs, I think our thing is we get excited by that challenge. We don't get daunted by it.
We were looking at tapping into different media, so radio, perhaps community radio, plays, films, visuals.
Having information in supermarkets and malls, on public transport or the back of taxis, bus stops, on the side of buses, trains. Tapping into the messages that come from our Indigenous community, also really important.
We've really future-proofed our business by reducing our consumption of all of the things that impact climate change.
We are a very energy-hungry business. What we've sort of done to counter that is we've got 290 solar panels on the roof. We're installing a closed-loop cooling system for our stills, so we're reducing water usage that way.
When you choose a new appliance, making sure it's as efficient as possible, you have to consider moving away from gas, electrify as much as you can.
We want impact. So yes, we can tap into their values and push all their buttons, but how do we actually get them to go, oh yes, that's something I should do, to actually then doing it? And I think that it's that bite size, what's accessible. And for the people we've been talking about, we have to be super conscious about all of these barriers that we talked about earlier. So I don't think there's any point saying to somebody who lives in a rental property on very low income or no income, literally, to say you really should install some solar panels and a new battery system because that'll make you more resilient in a power outage. Like, that's not going to wash for them. It is just beyond reality for them. So we need to find what are those impactful things they could literally do in a day-to-day situation while experiencing an extreme event, but also into the future to help them be more resilient.
I think one of the biggest things people can do to prepare for climate change is make a plan
for different scenarios.
Being aware of, you know, whatever kind of disaster or whatever kind of weather event is coming up, thinking about it before it gets to you.
When I hear on the news that a heatwave's forecast, I think about my kids, my little kids, but I also think about my grandpa. So he's 94 now and he lives by himself still. So I ring him up and I say, right, you're coming over to our house for a few days and we'll look after you.
The best advice we can possibly give anyone who has a chronic health condition is actually to be prepared and to expect the unexpected. So maybe at least every 6 months, book in and see your GP and maybe even write down a bit of a plan. What are you going to do in the event of extreme weather event? Like what if you are stuck in your home for 3, 4, 5 days with smoke? What are you going to actually do if you can't leave home? Are you prepared to manage that?
Sort of think about the food you might need for the next few days, making sure there's ice in the freezer.
I think any businesses need to be prepared for emergencies because they are occurring unfortunately more and more often. So I think being prepared, having a plan in place and testing it every 6 months or so to make sure you're familiar with it. Don't just do it and put it in a drawer and forget about it. You need to really keep refreshing it and keep your team refreshed on it.
Once an emergency hits, you can't control what your mind's doing and you can go into panic, and if you haven't got all of that stuff written down and accessible, it's very difficult to actually respond in a way that's going to be able to help you cope with that and then recover after.
Know about what services and reliefs are put in place around you, around your family.
Our staff work outside and the business doesn't stop because it's 40 degrees. We've got now gaiters, which is what the guys drive around in, and they've got canopies over the top, so they're protected from the direct sunlight.
We also try to limit our landfill. We do that by sending our green waste through to Jeffreys and our spent grain in particular through to a local dairy farmer who picks it up. And we capture the rainwater we can and we use that for wash down and hose down water.
We have a huge impact on climate change. Our business definitely reduces the waste going into landfill, but more importantly, it reduces the amount of new trees required to produce the pallets each year. And so we're probably saving somewhere between 20 and 30,000 trees from felling yearly currently. We just can't continue to waste.
Interestingly, a lot of the research about adaptation and building resilience talks a lot about communities and how connected they are, and the real importance of people knowing each other, having someone to call on when something does happen.
It's better to have a good neighbour than a far friend. So the idea being that if you can call on the person next door or over the street, that's much more useful than your best friend who lives, 200 miles away or even 10 miles away.
Seeing what resources that you can share within your neighbourhood. For example, if someone's got a generator and can keep your medications cool if the power goes out, that's a really important one for a lot of people. But also just knowing that your neighbours are there for you and that you can provide support for them too is really comforting.
Do you have one other person you can rely on in your life? Like some people are living in quite challenging circumstances, and then they don't necessarily have someone around them that they can call on to help. It makes, life can get pretty tough.
And you know that it's good to have connection, but I think it's just reminded me how essential it is for older people or people who are unwell to have connections to other people. If they don't have children or their children are far away, then they need connections that are close by that can help them.
If you don't have the resources to implement the message, then it doesn't matter what the message is. On their own, they're not going to be able to do it. And so that's why that message of neighbourliness is so important.
What I would say to the small business out there is that let's not focus on what we can't do. Let's instead focus on what we can do. And if that is, a 1% difference, a 0.5% difference, do that. Because if we all do it, we're always going to be in a better place.
Get educated, you need to actually understand. So reading, watching videos, YouTube, etc. is what we did.
I think every little step that you make, like if it's just changing, sort of throwing something into a recycling bin rather than just into the bin, or actually taking your glass to a recycling depot and that sort of thing, it's just very small steps. And the more small steps make up the bigger journey. It's that simple.
Sometimes I think of it being the elephant in the room. It's the thing that we don't necessarily want to confront, and it's lurking there all the time over our shoulder.
Do something, but above all, get started.
There's so many different things that we can all do to better prepare for the impacts of extreme events as a result of climate change.
I would be more encouraged if we saw our government making changes
because this is asking us to adapt, but they don't seem to be adapting. You know, if you want to make sure people pick up things and feel hopeful, then you've got to be seeing it on the governmental level as well.
I think politicians should do these role plays.
I like it.
Yeah, round of applause. Building on the content generated through the workshops and the business briefing, and as shown in the film we have just viewed, we will explore a hypothetical situation tonight. As we explore this hypothetical scenario, I encourage you to think about your own personal circumstances, your families, your friends, your neighbours, community and business. I encourage you to consider, what would you do if we were to experience a 3-week period where we would have a heatwave, coupled with blanketing bushfire smoke and a power outage, followed by localised flooding. How prepared do you feel? How prepared do you think others in your community are for such a series of events? To help us explore this hypothetical scenario, we have assembled a panel of experts who have been sitting here patiently. With us tonight, we have on stage Liz Connell at the far end, Deputy Chief Officer, the South Australian State Emergency Service. Nigel Cooper, Senior Manager, Programs Asthma Australia. Crystal Chambers, we jump in here. Community Development Officer with the Red Cross. To my immediate right, Catherine McMahon, who's the Honorary Executive Officer of the Estuary Care Foundation. Abby Dixon. Abby, do you want to give us a wave? Is the Director of Corporate Services at the City of Port Adelaide and Enfield. Selma Barlow is the Economic Development Coordinator for Urban Projects at the City of Charles Sturt. And last but not least, Craig Basford, Big Shed Brewing, owner, brewer extraordinaire, co-founder, Director of Consumer and Business and Marketing, I think is your correct title.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that.
Slinger.
Some of these faces will look familiar because Nigel, Catherine, Crystal, Craig and Selma were all participants in the community workshops which just featured in that film. Now please welcome all our panellists tonight and thank you for being part of this special event. And again, a reminder that we are using Mentimeter to gather your questions. They are starting to trickle in here on this laptop on my left. And so please fire through any questions at any stage this evening so we can use them in the Q&A. So let's begin. Our hypothetical scenario starts with a heat wave and it's getting hot.
Hello and welcome to the Bureau's Climate and Water Outlook for January to March 2025. An El Niño is now well established across the tropical Pacific Ocean. El Niños are generally associated with warmer and drier conditions over Australia, particularly during summer, with an increased chance of extreme temperatures. Now, every El Niño is different, and climate models suggest that this particular event will continue to be strong and last until at least autumn. This means that impacts over Australia are likely to be stronger than during previous El Niños. Parts of South Australia and Victoria have experienced well below average rainfall for this time of year. This has meant early harvesting of wheat crops. Sustained dry conditions in the South Australian Murraylands and into Western Victoria has also seen grass fires start early, impacting livestock and property. Summer heat has arrived early as well in parts of southeastern Australia. Adelaide's average maximum temperature for November was 4 degrees above average, with December conditions expected to be at least 1 to 2 degrees warmer than average as well. With El Niño firmly established in the Pacific Ocean, warmer and drier conditions are likely for much of the country, particularly in the south and the southeast. In terms of temperature, daytime and nighttime temperatures are likely to remain well above average for southern and southeastern Australia. So in summary, 2025 is likely to start much warmer than average for southeastern Australia, so please keep an eye out for severe weather warnings in the coming weeks and months.
South Australians are being urged to prepare ahead of some very hot weather forecast from the middle of next week. Authorities say a heat wave is likely for the first time this summer.
Take care this week and be prepared. That's the message from the Bureau, which is warning of a week of temperatures above 35 degrees for the first time this summer.
So we're currently forecasting 35 degrees for Monday, 40 degrees for Tuesday, 42 for Wednesday and 45 degrees for Thursday. So it certainly has the makings of a significant heatwave event, and we're actually looking at extreme heatwave conditions developing.
For a heat wave, there needs to be at least 3 days of unusually high temperatures and excess heat. And the one forecast for next week is due to a high pressure system over the Tasman Sea.
So this heat wave is being caused by what we call a blocking high pressure system in the Tasman Sea. That's going to be directing persistent northerly winds down over South Australia. So that hot air mass from inland Australia is going to be brought down over southern South Australia.
Exposure to too much heat can cause everything from cramps to heat stroke, and Adelaide residents are being warned to stay hydrated and have a plan.
At this stage, it's going to be persisting for the remainder of the week, so hot through this week, right through the weekend, but potentially that system might break down early next week and bring some relief.
Hot conditions can lead to health issues for both the very young and the very old, so the Health Department is urging people to check on our most vulnerable. Rebecca Putty, ABC News, Adelaide.
Okay, as we've just heard, an extreme heat warning has been issued by the SES, and the forecast is for extreme heat over the coming days. Liz O'Connell, the SES is of course the leader when it comes to hazard, this sort of hazard in South Australia at this point in time. When the SES is issuing an extreme heat warning, what is the agency and other government your agency and other government agencies doing at this point in time to get ready?
Well, we started several months ago getting ready, so we've been working with our stakeholders doing pre-season briefings so that they are prepared as well. In the lead up, we've been working with the Bureau of Meteorology, so we've been talking about this weather that's coming. We've also been, in the lead up, been out doing our community engagement, and we're talking to our communities about getting prepared, and we're using some tools to engage. So we're saying, here, take this and go and meet your neighbour and encourage them to use some cooling tools, get to know your neighbour. We're also talking about looking after vulnerable, including pets, so keeping your pets hydrated. We're talking about having your properties prepared, so cleaning out your gutters and being prepared for that. As well, we've briefed our State Emergency Centre, and we've got our emergency service colleagues and other agencies prepared for the heat wave. We're starting to get the media episodes cranked up and on social media. So we're starting to put out the messaging about be prepared, get some food in for your house, try and modify your behaviour to adjust to the heat wave. An extreme end of the heat wave, those very severe events, everybody is affected. So if you're somebody who exercises, you need to modify your normal day-to-day activities and exercise in the very coolest part of the day. Likewise, if you're out and about, beware how hot vehicles get, and certainly not leaving children or vulnerable people in cars. That's particularly dangerous. So those messages would be start to rolling out in the lead up.
Are you also worried about like your own crew?
Yes.
Like having to make, because I can imagine if you're in that role, you're predisposed to trying to help others, not necessarily paying any attention to how you're doing.
Absolutely. So we would have also been setting up our state control centres, and we would be reinforcing those messages about taking care, remaining hydrated, having proper coverage, PPE, protective equipment, so that our crews are well cared for.
Let's just go to Crystal as well, considering your role at the Red Cross and the vital service that your organisation provides. When you hear that sort of forecast, what do you start to think, and who are you most worried about?
Absolutely. So similarly to Liz and SES, we've been preparing our staff and volunteers to activate our Telecross Ready heatwave service. So thinking about people who are vulnerable and isolated in the community that don't necessarily have someone to check in on them when these heat waves happen, we have a telephone service where we're able to contact these people to check on them daily and make sure that they're drinking water, keeping cool, using fans and air conditioners and things like that, keeping their windows closed, blinds down during the heat of the day. But absolutely making those preparations within the organisation well in advance so that we're ready to go as soon as it hits.
Craig, you're a brewer.
Yes.
Hot weather's a good thing for you, isn't it?
To a point. I mean, believe it or not, there is a temperature where beer is just not palatable. I haven't found it yet, but I'm sure it's there. You know, when we just listening to that, like you're talking 45, 44 degrees. First things first, people don't want to go out. You know, you got that classic, like they describe it, you know, that northerly comes in, you open the front door and that kiln hits you. You're not going anywhere. So it's bad for business for a start. But the other thing is for us, it becomes two things. I have to make sure the machinery is okay because it generates its own heat anyway, and it's not designed to work at 45 degrees, even inside. You know, even inside our shed/warehouse, it's still going to be, if it's 45 outside, chances are it's probably still going to be 38 around the place. So there's that to concern myself with. But more importantly, the brewers and the crew that work there. You know, we are already working in a physical environment, physical work that's dealing with hot water, steam, warm things, humid conditions. So you add 45 degrees on top of that, it becomes actually quite dangerous. So in much the same way as the SES have protocols and things like that, we will shift work forward where we can to get it done earlier in the day so that by the time the heat of the day comes, the work is finished.
Abby?
I was just going to add to Crystal, malfunction as I'm first talking. So our community services staff are also thinking when we're entering into that extreme heat, and they've got their lists of vulnerable people. We make sure we don't duplicate what the Red Cross are doing, but there are some people that are not on Red Cross lists that we also will make contact with to make sure that they're preparing for that extreme heat. We also work with services with the homeless as well when we're entering that code red period.
Selma, what about from your council's perspective? Heat waves, do you extend service opening hours? I mean, you know, we've got Craig talking about pulling production forward. Do you open early? Do you shut later?
We do adjust what we do. It's very important, as the previous panel members have already said, that we communicate with our community, make sure that they're aware of the impending heat wave. I communicate with the business community and reminding them, as Craig said, that staff will be impacted by intense heat. They won't be sleeping as well. They won't be paying attention. Reminding our business owners to give them extended breaks and those kinds of things.
So one for the whole panel here. We've talked about the immediate action that happens around an event like this. But what can people do to be better prepared for the next heat wave and the one after that?
From a business perspective, it's really important to have your planning in place. Have a business continuity plan that looks at all the aspects of your operations of your business. What could be impacted by intense heat? Could it be your stock, your staffing levels, those kinds of things? Looking at all the risks and then looking at the procedures and plans that you can put in place to mitigate those risks. And it's even planning ahead for those hot weather events. If you've got an outdoor dining space, think about doing some clever planting. Like Craig said, people don't want to go out and do business and they don't want to go out to cafes if it's too hot. So try and make that space comfortable.
Let's just take that a little bit further with Nigel. People not wanting to go out in the heat. Is that an issue for people who suffer asthma, and can that create a knock-on effect with them getting medication in a timely fashion?
Yep, absolutely. And look, even though I'm representing Asthma Australia, it's really about people with chronic conditions. So, quite often people, the weather starts to warm up, they might not have a medication supply at home. And sometimes with the elderly, I used to be a district nurse years ago, and I'd go and visit people and they'd be dressed up in their woolen stockings, their woolen jacket, and it'd be 45 degrees, but they'd still go, well, today is Wednesday, I've got to go out and do my grocery shopping, I've got to pick up my script. So you'd even have people, and I'd go to these houses and I'd go, well, what are you doing? And, well, it's Wednesday, I've got to do this. So sometimes people don't plan ahead. They might only have, for asthma perspective, their puffer might be getting really low, they need it, so they panic and they either go out in the heat, or conversely, they do the opposite, where they actually think it's way too hot, I'll ration my medications, or I won't take my medications, and I'll be okay. It's only a little bit of asthma, and I'll be fine.
Abby, let's talk about urban heat island effect and some of the heat mapping work that's being done. Can you talk us about why this is important and how it can be used to help cool a suburb?
Yeah, so the heat mapping is really important. I think we heard that with the intro with our three mayors talking about the importance of data. So, with the infill and the development that's happening, we're experiencing more loss of canopy. So having that heat mapping can then help us plan where we do our tree planting to address gaps in tree canopy, where we are low in open space and where we need to, seek to either expand open space if we can purchase land or just develop that green space. Makes a huge difference in that urban heat as well. It also, we've also layered that, so with some other data that shows areas of disadvantage across our cities as well. So the three councils have layered that with the CEPA disadvantage index, and that just even gives us richer data around, and what we found is where we've got high urban heat areas, it's also where it correlates with high disadvantage. So that informs then what sort of community support services that we need to do in that space as well. It helps us to talk with developers and to advocate for good development across our cities. So, thinking about where you are having higher density, that we do have space for trees in yards to address with that, the design of actual buildings as well that cope with extreme heat as well. So all of that data really helps improve our planning and our strategies, and I'm losing my mic as I speak.
Very well held on there. And Catherine, I'll quickly come to you. Obviously, we've talked about the importance of canopies in an urban situation. Can you give us a context in a coastal situation? How important and what sort of stress does, if we talk about the estuaries around Port River and the like, extreme heat place on the vegetation there?
Yeah, I suppose I think immediately of sort of like the dunes groups who will have been planting in the winter period. So in the same way that we're trying to look after our gardens, then they've invested a lot of effort in going out to kind of plant in those sorts of environments or in other environments. And then when these sorts of stresses come along, then you don't want to be losing lots and lots of your plant stock at that point. So, and it's really tough in terms of what people on low incomes can do around their own homes, because it's really important to get some shade onto our east and west facing kind of windows. And certainly things like creepers can do that, but then people have got to have some continuity around their housing, and they've also got to be able to potentially meet those costs.
And there's a neat little trick if you've got some vegetation out. If you actually get a sprayer and spray onto it, it just makes such a difference in the cooling. It's like nature's own very cooling system.
Yeah, and there's a bit more focus now to looking at things like having your kids run under the sprinklers again, if you have got a bit of lawn. 45 degrees is a real challenge. But on the other hand, instead of kind of cultivating a lifestyle that's air conditioners and electronic gadgets, then some time, kids spend outdoors has benefits for them and has benefits for the environment as well.
I just want to jump in and add with vegetation, and particularly around what people can do at home themselves. Part of your planning when a heat wave is approaching is to make sure you water your plants or your lawn several days in advance, so that it's got enough water to be able to survive that prolonged heat period. Because I think a lot of people go the night before a heat wave's coming, they'll just water a little bit or a lot, but it's still needs those few days in advance so it can really survive, and then, as Liz said, act as a natural air conditioner around your house.
Let's move on. In our hypothetical scenario, we are now 1 week into this heat wave, and then a bushfire starts north of Adelaide.
Smoke haze across Adelaide's western suburbs caused by a scrub fire is posing a major health risk for residents. The smoke has drifted south from 2 wells thanks to winds associated with the city's heat wave. Asthma Australia is urging residents to avoid prolonged exposure and stay indoors if needed.
And that might also involve doing things like sealing their doors and windows, obviously closing them. If they have air conditioning, putting it on to recirculate, so we're not bringing outside air into it. And if they do need to go outside for shopping or appointments, to perhaps wear a P2 mask, which will help filter out some of those small particles.
There's also a warning to drivers to take care while visibility is reduced in the western suburbs. Adelaide is sweltering through week 2 of an unprecedented heat wave. It's due to a high pressure system over the Tasman Sea. And there's no reprieve in sight, with temperatures forecast to soar into the mid-40s at the weekend.
Okay, as we just heard, the heat wave continues and there is now a fire burning in the northern part of Adelaide, which is blanketing the western suburbs with thick smoke. Nigel Cooper, now we heard from you in that broadcast just then, and we know that asthma sufferers are particularly vulnerable to bushfire smoke. Firstly, can you talk us through how an asthma sufferer might be impacted by extreme heat? Yep. Then secondly, how they might be impacted by other extreme events like thunderstorm as well.
Yeah. Well, extreme heat, obviously you can get quite distressed, you can get quite uncomfortable, your anxiety levels can increase. And if you're in a home where you don't have any air conditioning or where you can't get out, it just impacts and increases that things of anxiety and other symptoms. But the thing about bushfire smoke, which I think we really noticed at the beginning of this year, was the bushfire smoke has very, very tiny particles, and the tiny particles are really easily breathed in. And often when we have a bushfire, they might last 1 or 2 days and then they clear. But this year in particular, around the eastern states of Australia, that smoke hung around for weeks. So even with our messaging where we're saying to people, you know, stay indoors and put your air conditioning on, recirculate, and don't go to work and don't exercise, people can do that for 12 hours, 24 hours. But when it goes into days and weeks, it suddenly becomes a major health issue. You know, people can't get out of their home. They're dealing with heat. If they don't have air conditioning, they've got nowhere to go. And some of our older homes, the smoke actually starts to seep in. So even though you think your home is this really kind of like, you know, haven, you're inside your home, the smoke is seeping in. You can't open your doors and windows because of the heat and the smoke. We know smoke is an irritant for your airways, and then your asthma just flares up. So obviously a difficulty can be, you know, are you prepared? Do you have your medications? Do you have people helping you? That kind of stuff. But one of the very quick learning that we learnt through the bushfire season this year was that, one, the extended period had a major impact and people were caught really unawares. So again, I only have a touch of asthma. It doesn't worry me. After 2 days of breathing in fine particles of smoke, people's asthma really flared up. And then what we also found was that once the event had finished, a lot of people go, well, great, the weather's cooled down and everything is fine. You know, everybody will be okay now. But asthma doesn't go away. So your airways are really inflamed. You've got spasming going on. You've got excess mucus production. So even though the event has finished, your asthma continues to deteriorate and continue to get worse. One of the best preparations for your asthma is to actually take a preventer. Usually an inhaled steroid, but they take 2 to 3 weeks to really kick in. We don't know a bushfire is going to occur in 3 weeks' time, therefore I'll take my preventer now. The event happens and you can be caught unawares because your preventer's run out or you're not taking it. So in that immediate situation, you're really reliant on your short-acting, your blue puffer, and you're really struggling to deal with the inflammation that's going on underneath. And secondly, as I said, when the event is over, you're still struggling after the event when everyone else is going, great, the smoke is cleared, you still can't breathe.
Liz, let's go to you. Obviously, we're now a week into a heat wave. We've now got a bushfire going on as well. How would emergency services people and other responders be feeling at this particular point in time?
So the activity would have escalated considerably. So we would have, CFS would have crews out actually fighting the fires. The State Emergency Centre would be activated, and the agencies around the room would be doing the planning around that. For us in the SES, we would be setting up a base camp to support the volunteers that are fighting the fires, and also doing the logistics work. We'd also be doing quite a bit of honing of messaging, because the fatigue around messaging for heatwave would be starting to take place, so people hearing the same messaging. So we'd be a bit more targeted about the messaging. A little bit of sort of building on what Nigel was saying earlier, for people that are in their homes and older people in their homes, we might be doing some work around recognising what the symbol is, that especially if it's the first heat wave in the season. How is it that you change your air conditioner over from heat to cool? Because those symbols actually look quite similar. We would be continuing to try and get the message out about staying cool, and particularly trying to cool down at night. So our bodies are a little bit like engines and machinery. They don't cool down at night, they're under even more pressure.
Right, we'll go to Crystal now. We've heard how people with asthma would be going at this point in time. We've had a little taste of what the emergency services would be like. What about the people that you're dealing with on a daily basis? How are they travelling a week into a heatwave event like this, and then having to deal with the added complication of bushfire smoke?
Yeah, there's been quite a few cases where we've spoken to people that are isolated and at home indoors for a prolonged amount of time, and, for example, need their medication. So, we might be suggesting to them to get onto their GP and renew their prescriptions, get it sent to the pharmacy, and then get the pharmacy to deliver the prescriptions to them, so that they don't have to go outside and expose themselves to the smoke particles. But there's a lot of nuance in those conversations. Everyone's got different situations, so it's quite a challenge. And then we also have a secondary activation that would go on if a bushfire has occurred, but we'd need another pool of volunteers to then go out to a relief centre and be activated there, so managing two different sets of volunteers as well.
I was going to say, can you talk us, and for people who might not have seen it, how the Red Cross is activated in a severe bushfire event like the one we're talking about here in this scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally in South Australia, Housing SA is the overarching organisation that manages a relief centre, and we would be activated to support Housing SA in a relief centre. So we would send people out to perform something called psychological first aid, and be there to provide a sense of calm and safety for people coming into the centre that have experienced or been impacted by those bushfires. And the idea behind that is to help them, with their self-efficacy, find out what they need for themselves and then direct themselves to what they need.
And given what we've seen in South Australia in recent years, that's a service you are having to provide more frequently.
Absolutely.
Craig, can I come to you?
Yes.
Bushfire smoke. What impact does that have on your supply chain, specifically hops?
Hops. So if we had in this specific situation, it actually probably wouldn't hurt hop supply that much, because hops are very specific on where they grow. They don't grow a lot in the Adelaide Hills. But if you had a fire like that through Victoria, Tasmania, we've had bushfire or wildfires, as they call them in the US, through hop farms and decimate crops, both through the actual burning and smoke taint. Smoke taint, absolutely. And so it's not any different to wine in that sense. Hops will take on those characteristics. In this situation, I'd probably be more concerned in terms of our supply around that ash getting into the water supply and what that would do. We run a 4-stage filter, but it's certainly, I would imagine, I mean, touch wood, we haven't had to deal with it. I would imagine that if it was sufficient, it would get through and cause taint into the finished product, because beer is 98% water. So in this situation, again, I'm looking at machinery, making sure that if the smoke is thick enough, if it's not, making sure filters and stuff are clean, and staff. We've got staff with chronic illnesses, so I've got to make sure that that if they
they are going to be put in a situation where they're at risk, I need to make sure they stay home, and then I've got to manage that labour situation as well.
Catherine, can I come to you? Earlier in the film we heard how important neighbourly connections are at times like this. What have been your experiences, either providing or receiving support during an extreme event?
In prep for this, I was thinking about a situation that actually is going to relate to the flooding scenario that we're going to talk about. So in 2014, actually it was on the 14th of Feb, 2014, I think was right, at 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a major kind of downpour, and people woke up the next morning in an area just opposite Adelaide Brighton Cement off Victoria Road. So 13 people, 13 homes actually had water above their floorboards. And one couple told me with 3 young children that it was when they stepped out of bed that they realised this is the extent of what had happened. So in that community, what emerged was that there were people who were renters, and the flooding was such that if they were in homes that were flooded, then they would tend to move out. There were some elderly people who'd been there for a considerable period of time. And then there were some younger families who'd moved in and had absolutely no idea that this was an area that was going to be sort of vulnerable to flooding. And this was a stormwater problem. So what we actually had, as well as the houses that were flooded, we had lots of other people whose yards were flooded. The streets sort of were flooded. And also, because the system runs from Military Road down to the Port River, somewhere in that system, people had hooked up sewage to the stormwater to the sewage system.
That's not meant to happen.
So people actually had sewage coming up through their stormwater kind of outlets. So it was one of those situations where actually it was the guy who had won the Neighbour of the Year award, the Messenger's Neighbour of the Year award, who lived in that street. And I knew him because we were engaged in a Save Your Local Park campaign. And he'd given us money towards that from the award that he'd won. And so then when I started talking to Len, it was like, how's this happened? And he said, well, it had actually happened several times since the 2000s. And then it just seemed like, this is not right. You know, this shouldn't be happening to people. So Tony Baisley from Port Adelaide Residents, Environment Protection Group, and I worked with some of the people who were affected, because we weren't directly affected. But to get hold of the engineering kind of reports to find out where this thing was stuck, which of course had a lot to do with money and being in a more disadvantaged sort of area. So we did freedom of information, we had public meeting, and we lobbied councillors, and we lobbied the Stormwater Management Authority. But
I guess that doesn't happen without an event like this. So it's actually while it was a horrible event to go through, in some regards actually brought you closer together.
Yeah, it did, and it also made me realise in the way that people who experience bushfires aren't necessarily best placed to actually deal solely with the recovery process, that other people in the community also needed to assist in that kind of process. And it was fantastic to be able to reciprocate Len's generosity, because yeah, he was Neighbour of the Year for very good reasons.
Sometimes it's the things that come up out of nowhere the outcomes, or sorry, the causes of the fire, the cause of the situation might be a bushfire, but it causes other problems along the chain that you might not think of. For example, like we were here at the start of the year, we had those fires up in the Adelaide Hills. And we see them, you know, out on the coast here at Royal Park, and we're nervous for our friends and colleagues and just for our state generally up there, but not too fussed about it. It's no grave danger to us in that sense. But then we had a pipe main burst 300 metres down the road, which cut off our water supply. Now we need water to make beer and flush toilets and do all the things that we need to get done. So a quick chat with SA Water saying, guys, look, we need water. And to their credit, they were really good about it. Like, yep, no worries, we'll get you a tanker out there. 2 hours later, they ring me and say, oh, we don't have any tankers. They're out pumping water to bushfires. And as much as you want to get shitty with it, it makes a lot of sense. So it's and I had no consideration for that auxiliary you know, the pressures that one incident can cause around the place.
On the rest of the
Absolutely.
system.
And I suppose the other aspect of this is when people are working together, and you think particularly about a small business community, they perhaps don't understand the risks. They under-insure. They insure for their assets and for their buildings, but they don't actually insure for the disruption to business and the loss of trade and the ongoing loss of trade.
Yep.
We're now part way through the hypothetical scenario where we've now had a heat wave for 2 weeks. The region is blanketed by bushfire smoke, and now there's a power outage.
Almost 20,000 homes and businesses are without power in Adelaide's western suburbs tonight. The high power demand in the city's heatwave conditions has placed a strain on the city's electricity infrastructure. A massive fault in a transformer at the Fulham Gardens substation has caused outages in Woodville, Findon and Seaton.
This is going to take us many hours to actually get people back online, because basically we're going to have to connect people to other supply lines. That means switching small groups of customers, and with 19,000 it's going to take us most of the day, particularly with the heavy loads obviously we're having during this heat wave.
SA Power Networks says it could be this evening before power is restored to some residents. Adelaide's sweltering through its second week of record temperatures.
Okay, so we've just had a massive fault at a power substation in Fulham Gardens, 20,000 customers knocked offline. That's homes and businesses. Selma, what would be happening in businesses at this very point in time? Now, talk us through some of the impacts they might be experiencing and how they're trying to get their head around what's going on.
So one of the main issues that they will be thinking about is stock. So during the current times, many businesses have moved from a just-in-time inventory process where they keep minimum inventory because it saves cost. But during the current pandemic, they've been operating under a just-in-case approach where they're carrying more stock. So how do they keep that stock cool? How do they look after that? How can they work with perhaps the local businesses, those that have invested in backup generators, and how can they work together to keep those products safe? If you've got no power and you've got no air conditioning, you're pretty much shutting up shop.
Craig, your business has been through at least one or two significant power disruptions off the top of my head, 2016, 2017.
Yeah.
What did you learn from those, and how would you be better placed to respond to this particular scenario here where you're out of power again?
Yep, so yeah, breweries are very power hungry things. Outside of trying to keep the beer cool, which isn't actually a major concern once the beer is finished. I mean, it'll age faster, but it's not like milk, it doesn't go off in that sense. Our biggest issue is that we could have anywhere up to 50,000 litres of product at different stages of fermentation around the brewery. And that's where the temperature is really important. You know, you get a 5-degree rise in temperature across that beer, you'll actually get a very different flavour profile. And unlike winemakers who get to just blame vintage and it can be different, we got to make it the same every single time, otherwise people crack the shits with us. So that is really important for us. And luckily, being in the newer facility, the bigger brewery with the bigger tanks, thermal mass actually works in our favour to a large extent there. We probably got 2 days before it becomes a problem, in which time we would need to get our hands on a generator to make it work.
Have you invested in a generator?
No, not at this stage, no. And again, this is the problem. And being a small business, I know we look really big down on Port Road, but in the scheme of things, we're a small operation, very capital intensive operation. So we bite off bits as we go along. And yeah, so while we've got access to a generator through going through hire companies and stuff, that we sort of have a standing order, I guess you'd call it. We don't have our own generator on site as yet. The toss-up will be generator or batteries for our solar.
Can I just jump back to you, Selma? Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a local ice cream manufacturer, and I asked him this question, and he said, "Oh, I'll be good for a couple of days. I'll just keep the fridge doors closed."
Doesn't really fill you with confidence, does it?
No.
So further to that then, what can small businesses do to better prepare for the next extreme event and going into the future?
Again, probably going back to your business continuity planning, there are some great resources on the SA Gov business website, free templates that you can work through, look at your processes, look at the impacts from fire, flooding, those kinds of things. What are your processes that are going to be impacted? How can you prepare? How can you work with your staff so that they have an emergency plan? But also, how can you look at your inventory arrangement and those kinds of things? How can you look at storage? So lots of planning. All of our councils have some great business advisors that are happy to work through the process with you. So take advantage of those. We've also got places like the Adelaide Business Hub.
Abby, can I come to you and look at more specifically some of the issues linked to council services and the ability or not to basically provide those in a situation when you don't have any power?
Yeah, so it's very challenging when the power goes out, particularly in an extreme heat environment, because often our facilities are areas of refuge. So our libraries are popular extreme heat if people don't have aircon at home. We'll monitor the situation. Our staff won't go to close if it's still safe, if there's enough natural light in and it's still cool. We won't, close the doors and send people home. But if it's going to be extended power outage, then obviously we need to, start. Some of our services can't operate as well. So it's really working on a skeleton staff. The well-being of, vulnerable people is always at the forefront during those times. And we do have, actual hard copies of contact details to make those calls to vulnerable people as well. We'll work with the agencies, for people who may be, sleeping rough or just need extra support or wondering what's happening. And obviously the communications is really important during that time as well. So,
Crystal, can I now come to you? Can you tell us a little bit about Climate Ready Communities and what the program is aiming to achieve over the long term?
Absolutely. So Climate Ready Communities is a program that Red Cross set up a number of years ago and have been working closely with lots of local councils. At the moment we've been working with AdaptWest, and the aims of the program are to help connect community members with each other and with the council, and with the information around climate change, the projections that we're facing and what to prepare for. And at an initial level, get people confident with this information to be able to talk to other people around it, but also prepare themselves and role model the preparing to the broader community as well, and then reach out to their communities and get prepared for climate change, and do it also in a way that we're minimising our footprint.
If we jump back to the power outage, I'm going to go to you, Liz. Is this the point in time when SES High Command start to rip their hair out?
It's certainly, power outages are very common when we have heat waves, so it's not unusual to lose power. So again, in our preempting our messaging, we would be talking to people about what to do without power, and certainly encouraging businesses to be prepared. We would, I guess, also be starting to think about forward for what's coming for the next few days. We'd be talking with the Bureau of Meteorology, because we'd be perhaps expecting that there's a weather system coming in, and start to be looking forward as well. So we'd be hoping that our colleagues at SA Power Networks can continue to work and bring those systems back online as quickly as possible, and that people are able to take refuge in places where it is a little bit cooler and they do have backup systems.
I guess that's the thing, is trying to keep those backup systems up and going for as long as possible. To both you, Abby, and Selma, have councils had to invest heavily in additional backup systems in light of the challenges that the South Australian grid's faced in the last 4 to 5 years?
Certainly different. I suppose it's working through what are the core things that you need to keep, and working on a skeleton staff. We don't have backup systems at all our libraries, or we haven't invested to that extent. But yeah, it's an interesting question as this stuff becomes more commonplace, whether that's just part of your business continuity planning.
I think we're probably just the same, yeah. And just making sure that your data's protected and those kinds of things. But in a more practical sense, yeah, it's just a skeleton staff that we'd keep on board, as we have done through the first few days of lockdowns and things.
Sorry, Rory, I just want to jump in with a bit of an example of, I think, a community that we could learn some things from potentially. In the 2016 power outage, I was in Ceduna, and that community is used to having all sorts of different issues. They're so far away from Adelaide, and so when that power outage hit, they had all of their essential services set up with generators, so their hospital, their supermarket, their petrol stations, and of course the pub is an essential service, all had generators and were able to operate as usual, as well as some of the Aboriginal communities outside of Ceduna as well. They were able to sustain themselves through those 3 days of power outage, whereas just down the coast, Port Lincoln, as you'd mentioned, where you were, experienced a completely different situation.
Very, very different. They had no power for days on end, being at the bottom of the transmission line as they tried to reboot the rest of the grid, if those remember back in 2016 correctly. Now, I'll go back to you, Craig. You discussed the concept of batteries.
Yep.
While we're talking about that as potentially a firming mechanism, have you come close to making the plunge? Have you done the numbers on it, and does it stack up yet?
Yeah, it actually looks pretty good. Because a lot of the time we generate, because we do have over 200 kilowatts of power coming through the solar on the roof now. So, and we've got a cool little monitor that shows how much we're using versus how much we're creating and all that sort of stuff. And I know that on more often than not, I'm yet to see it, even in winter. I haven't seen it dip too far below, so we're creating an excess all the time. And with that in mind, then suddenly batteries make sense because we're not pulling from the grid. My only concern, I guess, from an environmental point of view is it's hard to get a grasp on. Is that a better option than running a generator sporadically? I'm not 100% sold on that yet. But the batteries themselves stack up in terms of being able to generate enough power for us because of the solar. We lose power for a period. The solar can keep essential services, beer production, running. So that pub can keep
keep pouring and it goes on from there.
I'm hoping some people tonight stopped by to speak to a couple of the Climate Ready Communities champions, as we call them, people that have done the training, because there's a few people that are looking at organising a workshop around community renewable energy and potentially batteries in the AdaptWest region. So there's some really good work going on in the community exploring that right now too.
Cool.
And there's also the councils offer grants to businesses for renewables as well to invest in. So, yeah.
So, we have been in a heat wave for 2 weeks. Bushfire smoke is blanketing the region. We have a power outage, and now there's a storm brewing.
Heavy rain and winds are forecast to bring Adelaide's two-week heat wave to an end. The slow-moving thunderstorms are forecast to travel east across the state late morning, prompting warnings from authorities.
The potential for some quite significant rainfall with those thunderstorms. So could be looking at 30, maybe 50 millimetres in an hour falling over metropolitan Adelaide, including those western suburbs. And with that, we're likely to see some flash flooding. So certainly take care and look out for warnings.
Although we're seeing some welcome relief to the heat wave that we've had across South Australia, we are seeing that forecast from the Bureau of Meteorology for thunderstorms bringing some significant rain, especially across metropolitan Adelaide. So we're just asking that all members of the community take caution with what could be some flash flooding events, especially when you're on the roads.
The heat wave has been marked by fires, smoke haze and power outages across Adelaide's western suburbs.
Okay, so the heat wave is abating as a thunderstorm rolls in, but now we have another extreme weather event where localised flooding is occurring. Abby, talk us through what happens in the western suburbs when they receive such a large volume of rain in a short period of time.
So flooding is a significant risk for the Western region, so the councils do know where the at-risk areas are, so they obviously work closely with the SES if we're expecting flooding in that space. We continue to invest in stormwater, pump stations as well to deal with that excessive inundation of water through that space. But there's some areas that we know also need sandbags as well, so we work with the SES with that. Our crews.
How close is that relationship? How close does it have to be at times
Very
like this?
close.
Very close.
So we'd be putting up some plans beforehand about where we would put the sandbag distribution areas. We would be directing people to our website about where to get those sandbags, and also to the resources there about how you build the sandbags, because there's a special process around doing that so you don't get too much leakage.
Abby, what sort of things would we see when the flood water does come in?
Yep, water.
Lots of
it.
Lots of water. Yes. Yeah, I'll pay that. No, fair enough.
Yeah, so, and,
So what outcomes would you...
Come on, mate.
The roads in the areas that they will flood, and there is a point where you've got to allow the infrastructure below to kick in, and the plan is that it takes the water away. But obviously there are some areas in our cities that doesn't work, and when it's the extreme downpour of rain, that's when your systems are under pressure and don't always cope with it. So the sandbagging can help, the extra pumping out to help the systems cope with the inundation as well. Where the roads are flooded, there's issues also if cars are driving down there that then pushes the water up into the surrounding properties as well. And, flooding can be a bit exciting for some people, so you can have some people out sightseeing as well, which is a risk in terms of community safety, and also a risk with creating that water and pushing it out and causing damages to properties as well. So we'll work with SAPOL in that space where streets are flooded, and look to close those streets. Sometimes, our trucks are then used just to park across the street and stop that traffic going down.
Liz, can I go back to you? What do you think people could be doing now to adapt to better deal with these sort of flooding events in the future?
So there's a few things. One is actually be aware of what your risk is. So know if you're in a flood area, talk to your neighbours, talk to your council to find out whether you are in a flood area. Obviously insurance is an important tool in your toolkit. Know how you're going to actually get out of your property if you need to, what's the safest route for you to get out, and where you're going to go. Do some work beforehand around what's your emergency kit look like, what sort of things are you going to pack up, what's your important papers, make sure you've got a battery operated radio so you can listen to 891 and hear about what's happening. I think the other thing is to really start to think about what are the things that you're going to need for 48, 72 hours. So you've got your medication, you've got your phone, you've got your charger, all of those things, so that you need to relocate to another area. You're able to keep things running along and be able to manage away from your home environment.
I think it's worth adding, like the agencies work together, so the councils are working with the SES. We have our staff clear on the messages that are going out and what's happening. We'll often have our customer service like staff, you know, the floods don't just finish at 5 o'clock, so they'll work through the evening to be a person at the other end to give that information as well. So that communication's really important. And for our crews out there, you know, delivering sandbags as well, I think it's just that support and knowing that, you know, we're working together.
And I think as community members, if we're seeing those bomb warnings or we're seeing them through our councils, then if we've got ways of spreading that message to people who might not be aware, I think that's really important too.
And it's being aware of flood and storm events further up in the hills and stormwater running off that's coming into, say, our Western region. For example, areas such as West Lakes. Normally you can swim in there, but 2 to 3 days after a storm you can't.
Just how big a problem is that? I mean, obviously, you're the beach-facing council areas of, or some of them at least, of the Adelaide metropolitan area and the hills. How big a problem is the stormwater runoff?
You could probably answer that better than I can, but certainly it's not been as big a problem as probably you have in Port Adelaide. Is that right?
I mean, it is an issue, like with the, you know, picking up the pollutants and going into the waterways as well. So yeah, that's, you know,
people that see it from the Torrens. So the Torrens is one of the major sources. People see it drifting all the way down the coast. And I mean, part of our stormwater system, it's just from Military Road, but it is actually heading towards the dunes and the coastal areas. So yeah, people can see that on our beaches.
And Catherine, can you talk us through what happens to what are the environmental impacts of a flooding event? Can you talk us through that?
Well, it depends which it is, because if it's a major storm that's actually creating flooding through the stormwater system, because the stormwater system's completely overloaded, that's different from the kind of thing that we might get during, say, more like the winter months. So we've had it in May, June and July of this year, each time around full moon, where the tides were considerably higher than what they were due to be. And our structures, the seawalls and things that we have along the Port River, there are places where it's not currently adequate to hold the river. And that's a council that an issue that we in the council thoroughly recognise that, and the Mayor mentioned the work with CSIRO and the like, trying to get us a submission to Infrastructure Australia that the councils work with to try and make sure, because it's going to be a huge project, that those flooding defences are there along the Port River.
Yeah, the sea rolls need major investment.
And that comes at a cost, doesn't it?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've been doing, as Catherine talked about, we've been working with the CSIRO to really think about, you know, how do we build a resilient region, and that includes that infrastructure for rising sea levels as well. So it requires, you know, state and federal government investment in that space as well. We're looking at how do we also demonstrate the value of investing in that sort of infrastructure that creates a resilient city, doesn't cause significant damage when we're getting rising sea levels as well. So the work that we've been doing with CSIRO has been building that business case and showing the value creation of investing in that infrastructure, because it does have an upfront cost, but the value that's derived from that is significant as well. So it's a really important thing, and it involves the businesses, community groups, along with government to solve those issues.
Now, if we talk about storms, and you just touched on it then, Catherine, that can sometimes correlate with high tides. How concerned are you about the sand dune erosion along the coastline?
It's not an issue that I've actually spent an enormous amount of time on because my focus tends to be on the river. So I don't feel like I've got all the expertise to speak. But certainly my friends are very engaged in that issue. So there's a lot of advocacy from our community because, you know, what I'm seeing is that the dunes are now kind of got cliff faces. And so the plants and things that are there aren't going to be able to hold it in the same way.
We'll go to Abby as well, because obviously there's been big issues there recently
and
in
after
Semaphore.
significant storms, you see that damage and that, you know, the dune work, and that we've got some really active and committed community groups have done a lot of work on revegetating the dune, along with council staff as well. So it's really a joint effort as well, but it's a really important one because that storm water, and we're seeing more of those events, really have a significant impact on the dune ecosystem.
I was just thinking as well, as you're talking about some of those health impacts. So we talk about that's the storm surge or the water rising, etc. But as soon as the water starts to settle, what happens is we get mould growing, and then we have mould growing, you know, in our homes, in our carpets, around our homes. And so me putting my asthma hat on again, one of the key things is mould is a major trigger for people with asthma. So sometimes you can't even see the mould, so you might do your cleanup and not even realise, and you've got mould spores in the air, and you're sleeping in a house that's damp, and it can impact your asthma. And you can be thinking, I don't know what's happening here, what's wrong? The smoke has cleared, and the rain has cleared the air, and now I'm struggling to breathe. And the other thing I was just thinking about, you were talking about, you know, preparing. One of the events that happened in Australia in 2016 in November it was called thunderstorm asthma. And we hadn't seen it for many years, but we'd gone through a heat wave, and what we had was these incredible strong winds that were being whipped up, and they were whipping up a lot of ryegrass pollen. And the ryegrass pollen was going up into the atmosphere, and then the actual pollen particles were actually starting to explode, and then they were settling down on the community as the thunderstorm was starting to roll in. And what we saw was this incredible resurgence of people like asthma attacks, and people having asthma that had never had symptoms in their life.
Or were they people who hadn't had asthma since they were a child?
Yeah, both. Both. And we know that you don't grow out of asthma. So if you had asthma as a child, your asthma, you don't get cured. You always have this susceptibility. So people, one, were caught unaware. Secondly, we had people that had no history of asthma having their very first asthma attacks. And we had deaths as well recorded from this thunderstorm event. And people often think if it rains, my asthma will get better. But rain and pollen don't mix. So when rain and pollen mix, the pollen explodes and asthma symptoms increase. In Melbourne in particular, they had a 3,000% increase in ICU admissions over the 21st and 22nd of November in 2016. So how do you prepare for that? And I think one of those things is we talked about, you know, being well prepared. Think about, you know, what does it mean for me if there's a thunderstorm coming? What does that mean for my asthma? Do I have my medications? Do I have my plan?
And not just you, but your loved ones,
Absolutely.
Your children, your parents and what.
Yep, spot on.
Crystal, now, we're conscious that parts of the community have limited access to resources, be they financial, education, information more broadly. What can they do as an individual or on a household scale to sort of better be prepared for the impact of extreme events like we've been talking about this evening?
Yeah, and I think this goes for a lot of folk that rent as well, not having necessarily access to be able to change the situation easily. There are some very simple kinds of things that you can do at home for heat, for example, and for cold. If you don't already have block-out curtains, you can get yourself some block-out curtains or add some extra fabric to the backing of your curtains just to make them keep the heat out in summer and keep the heat in winter. Another thing that we recommend for people to do is if you don't have the ability to get a rainwater tank attached at your house, you can still divert some of that stormwater or some of that rainwater that's coming off your roof so that it doesn't cause problematic flooding around your house. Divert it to the garden, or even use an extra wheelie bin that you can put a tap in the bottom to be able to move that around when you need to, but divert it to other places. Another thing that Nigel mentioned in the video was sealing around your doors and windows with some foam tape to stop the drafts from coming in winter and in summer, but also stop smoke from entering the house as well. They're quite cheap and effective small measures that you can take, everybody can take them, and I have definitely done them myself in rental properties over the years.
I think it's worth too people looking at how they can shade, windows, particularly that face north, west, east. So even putting stuff during a heat wave up on the outside of it, really, what does it matter if you've got cardboard over your window or whatever?
What's some of the more advice that you give to asthma sufferers?
Be prepared is the key thing, and people go, what does that mean for me? And I think that really depends on you as a person, as a parent of a child, looking after elderly parents. Be prepared. So the first thing we would say to anyone with asthma is have regular checkups with your GP, at least once a year. Get an asthma action plan so you know what to do when your asthma actually worsens. And if you're somebody that perhaps has seasonal asthma, where you find your asthma is kind of in the background or not there at all during winter, but it's worse in summer, start your preventer early. So go to your asthma action plan, and it might say, from July, start taking your preventer again. So taking your preventer over the summer months when you know your triggers are higher, and then maybe you can, with your doctor, back off on them as the cooler months come. Be well stocked with your medication. And the other thing we find, people can take their puffers for years and years, and they can walk into a pharmacy and the pharmacist can say, do you know how to use your puffer? And they'll go, of course I do. I've had asthma for 20 years, Sonny. And so they're quite okay. And then you go, show me. And look, I've seen, this is actually the truth. One lady once put this puffer on her clothes, got her Ventolin and it was on her clothes. The Vicks effect.
Think it was Chanel number 5.
Correct. Chanel number 5, the Vicks effect.
Did you give her a Rexona and see if she liked it?
So probably, who knows? But the thing is, there's those kind of assumptions. So one of the things we do is, go to your pharmacist or your GP and say, look, would you mind just checking how I use my puffer? You can use spacer devices, which is much better than putting your puffer in your mouth. Most of it goes in your mouth and you swallow it. Using a spacer is better. You don't always need a nebulizer. So I guess, call Asthma Australia, of course, go see your GP, get an asthma action plan, make sure you're on the right medication at the right dose, and just be as prepared as you can.
Abby, can I come back to you again? We were talking about heat mapping a little earlier. Can you talk us through what else the AdaptWest councils are doing to prepare for the longer term impacts of climate change?
Yep. So AdaptWest have done the heat mapping, they've done flood mapping as well, and all of that data helps us indicate, the impacts of climate change and advocate for investment and in things like seawalls and other infrastructure that we need that needs other partners, not just local government. We've also done some good work talking about proofing homes. So we actually did some research around how you could proof a home for extreme heat, whether it's extreme weather, heat or cold. The importance of just having one room. So this was looking at social housing, and you may not be able to afford to invest in ducted air conditioning, but at least you have one room with a aircon unit in that can provide heating or cooling in those areas. The effectiveness of ceiling fans, having that good sealing of drafts and things like that. That was a really comprehensive report that we shared with different housing associations about how they could invest to support those more disadvantaged inner communities as well. We've just recently also done a extensive community survey and business survey just to understand people's awareness of climate change, because I think a common theme through tonight's discussion is we can't go alone. This needs a whole of community, all levels of government, business impact, and it needs that awareness and that awareness of what we can all do to change the way we live, to adapt to climate change, to keep ourselves safe, and also to care for the natural environment that's at significant risk. So that survey was really interesting, and what was really positive in that was there was a real heightened awareness of the impacts of climate change and the need for us to plan for the future and do things differently as well. So, yeah, working with, you know, places like we've commissioned different studies to really understand the impact on, and I think looking at the Western Adelaide, you know, we are a significant part of metropolitan Adelaide. We have some real strategic assets. You know, West Torrens Council has the airport. You know, we have, you know, the port and, you know, shipping coming in, a major logistic operations. We've got significant businesses in the space. I think we've got the most pubs across the region and the entertainment area and, you know, the defence investment. So these are really serious challenges that we're all facing, and for the well-being, you know, the care of our natural assets and also our economy, we need everyone to act. So AdaptWest is a really important part of that.
Catherine, you've been a part of this process all the way through, from the workshops to sitting up here this evening. For what you've seen and heard, is there one thing, key thing that stands out to you that people can do to be better prepared for future events?
Well, I hope in a way that participating in this kind of encourages people to think that thinking through these things actually can be a bit liberating in a way, because I think there can be a real kind of sense of dread. So I know when I came out of the first workshop, I thought actually it wasn't a downer at all. It actually stimulated a whole lot of thoughts. And I think one of the things we've got to learn to live with is sort of how do we experience the beauty of each kind of day, and at the same time kind of know that there are these major challenges and we've got to all collectively try and find ways of addressing them. So I think it's partly kind of finding those places in ourselves for dealing with that. Yeah.
Just pivoting off that, I'll go to Liz down the end. What do people most need to know about extreme events, and what do you think people can expect in the future?
I think in terms of what you need to know, so I've said quite a few times, know what your risk is. That's really important for you, because it's knowing that risk means that you can then take action, and there are small steps that you can put in place that will reduce the impact on you and your property. So know what those are and systematically build up for those things. Know your neighbour. Knowing your neighbour will keep you safer in a disaster than almost anything else. So know your neighbour, get to know your neighbour. If the one thing you do today when you go away from here is introduce yourself to your neighbour, you'll be far better off in the very next disaster. So those sorts of things are really well worth doing. In terms of, there are a few sort of key messages around, you know, keep your children away from floodwater. Playing in floodwater and is really, really dangerous activity, as is driving through floodwater. You cannot understand or see what is underneath floodwaters and what the road infrastructure is like, so just don't. Stop, turn around, stay away from it.
And just before I go, I've got a couple more questions here for our panel. We're going to take some of your questions really shortly. So here's your call, final call to get a question into us, of course, using the Mentimeter app online as well. I'm just going to go to you now, Selma. What resources are available to support businesses to adapt and plan for the future?
All of our councils work really, really closely together. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a great group of business advisors. They are available to work with you, to work through your business continuity plans. Just taking advantage of the resources that are available. We have a really supportive business environment. We're here to help. We can direct you to the resources that you need in terms of your planning, and even advisors that will look at the opportunities that come from these crises. If nothing has shown us more than this pandemic, is that there is always an opportunity out of a crisis. Don't be scared of it. You might come up with some great collaborations, like know your neighbour, know your local businesses. You know, one man's waste product is someone else's feedstock. So it's just drawing on those resources, reaching out, talking to us, and working with us and accessing the things that are available.
I guess following on from that to you, Craig, what's your message to business owners?
As far as, I mean, I would have really good insurance. Someone mentioned that before, and that's probably the biggest thing I reckon you can probably do. Like, you can sleep easy at night knowing you have that, because for all the planning in the world, shit happens, right? So you need to have that plan. You need that fallback when you need it. But other than that, it's planning. So you can go, if you plan for it, then you know what's going to happen. You're already a lot calmer. You can make better choices as opposed to trying to do it off the cuff. Like, I remember we were sitting in the pub at the Lakes when the first lockdown was called, I think, or the second lockdown, the pizza one. Yeah.
Pizzagate.
Yeah, old mate, that guy.
That was a very interesting press conference, by the way.
Anyway. Oh, I can imagine. It was, and it was funny. Jason and I was sitting there having lunch. We just had a planning meeting, as it turns out, with a mentor of ours, and we watched this thing live. And we're like, right, we're going to get back. And Jake Parkinson, ex-CEO of SNFL, he was the mentor we were talking to. He's like, guys, stop, think. What are your staff going through, and what's going on, and what's the messaging, and we actually got a much better outcome from having, because even we'd spent that 5 minutes actually planning for it, made such a big difference. So I think taking the actual time to make those plans, even if you don't stick to them, because things do happen, it sets you in good stead. But can I ask a question of Liz, please?
Absolutely.
So I'm really intrigued at this notion of knowing your neighbour. Like, I know my neighbour, but I don't know my neighbour. So when you say know your neighbour, what do I need to know? Like, what does that mean?
Knowing your neighbour means that if there are particular things, I'll use the example of, if you're an older person and you can't actually get up and clean your gutters, knowing your neighbour might mean that either you get a referral for somebody who can do it, or you get somebody to assist you. But equally, knowing your neighbour when you might well be away from your property, and you can ring your neighbour and say, hey, can you let my dog inside? It's in the backyard, and I know that we're going to get some flood water. So they're the sort of helping out and knowing your neighbour, and helping each other get out of, like you were talking about, bouncing off somebody, but helping one another get prepared and working together can just make such a difference. Particularly if they've been through the event previously, or you've been through the event previously, you have a bit of an idea about what to expect.
So then on that,
great advice.
I would say that as a business, you want to know your neighbour, because it's a very similar situation. Like, again, we had a heat wave at the start of the year. Bloke behind us was storing, I don't know why, he's a concreter or something, but he had 2 pallets of wine, and he's like, this is literally going to cook, can I store it inside your place? Like, I don't need a refrigerator, I just need it. Yeah, of course you can, man. So it sat there for, if he didn't have that, if he hadn't made that connection with us, he wouldn't get to do it. When we had the Pizzagate lockdown, we had a bunch of perishable food that was either going to go to waste, because when we gave care packs to all the staff, but we still had a great excess. Turns out that our chef has a good relationship with Ferguson's. Now they've got freezers, so a quick phone call to them, refrigerated truck, whip round, saved us probably 15 grand worth of stock. Now that's in a $7 million business. That's not the end of the world by any stretch, but it's nice to know. That's like the human connection. I think if COVID has taught us anything, man, that human connection is so important at all levels. I know, speaking from my own personal experience, my mum, bless her, I don't want to be a bother. Yeah. Be a bother, man. It's all good, right? Like, if you need a hand, there'll be no one, I don't reckon, that would honestly turn you down, especially in a situation where a fire or flood or those sorts of things. I generally think human beings are intrinsically decent. And so I think if you get to know people, it makes it even easier again. So yeah, don't be shy. Put your ego to a side. You're not a bother. Reach out.
Speaking of intrinsically decent human beings, we've got quite a few of them in the audience tonight, and they've got some questions for you guys.
Oh yeah.
So And the first one, which I'm going to put to you, is feel free to weigh in at any stage here. What's the best approach to discussing climate change with children without frightening them or leaving them without hope? Nigel Cooper.
Oh, great. I'll take my asthma hat off. As the dad of 3 kids, my youngest is 19, so I feel like I'm out of that zone. I think the key thing is tell the truth, be open and honest, but you don't need to scare and panic them. And what I've always said to my kids about the environment and climate change is more about we have a responsibility. We have a